Hi everyone, myself Navyatha, working as Assistant Professor in the Department of Cybersecurity and Data Science in MLR Institute of Technology. Today I am going to discuss about the topic transaction concept, and my overview of presentation includes what is transaction, operations in transaction and transaction states. So here let us discuss what is a transaction. Generally, what is a transaction? It is nothing but a series of activities or actions have been to be performed. Right. So, in our day-to-day lives, we used to perform many number of transactions regarding money transactions, data transfers, right? So, here to maintain database in a consistent manner, to maintain the integrity of a database, so we must use some rules and regulations for maintaining database consistency. So, this task is done by nothing but a transaction. Okay. So, let us discuss transaction in detail. Transaction can be defined as a group of tasks. That means number of tasks that we used to perform. If a transaction to be successful, we have to do some number of transactions. So, a transaction is a set of logically related operations. So, for example, let us discuss this transaction with a simple example. Okay. And a transaction can be defined as logical unit of work on the database. So, this may be an entire program, or else a part of a program, or else a piece of a program, or a single command like SQL commands, DDL or DML commands, insert or delete, which comes under DML commands, or it may engage in any number of operations on the database. So, what are the operations that we used to perform on database? That is nothing but to insert a data into a database, to delete a data from the database, to update the data, right, in the database. These are the basic operations that we used to perform with the database. So, here to maintain the database consistency and the integrity of a database, so we used to follow some set of rules and regulations. So, here comes the concept of transaction. Clear? So, let us discuss this transaction with a simple example. What is that? If at all I am one of the users and I want to transfer some amount, 500, to my friend, right? So, here A is one account holder, B is another account holder. Okay. So, the intention of this transaction is nothing but I want to transfer rupees 500 from A to B. That is what. So, transferring, that means if we went to a bank, then what we will do to transfer or to deposit some amount? We used to write one slip and we just give it to the bank employee, whoever present over there. But internally, they will do some sequential set of actions. Just like that, they won't transfer our money to that particular account which we have mentioned. Okay, there are some series of actions that they will check. So, what are those series of actions? So, here these are nothing but the series of actions which can be done internally. Okay, so first they will check what? A, open account A. That is nothing but, here A is nothing but one account holder who wants to transfer 500 rupees to B. Okay, so here first of all, what is the action? We used to open the account A. Next, what we'll do? We'll check the balance, right? So, how much balance is there? To transfer 500 amount to another account, we need to check our balance first, whether the amount is available in the account or not. So, that is what. So, they will check the balance. What is the balance that is already there in A's account? That comes under what? Old balance here. So, A balance. Here, old balance is equal to A balance. That is already existing balance. Okay. Next. What is the next transaction, next step? I want to deduct 500 rupees from my account. So, I want to minus 500 rupees from my old balance. Right. So, here old balance minus 500. I want to deduct 500. Now, this balance becomes what? New updated balance. Clear? So, this is nothing but what? The new balance. So here now the account holder A's account contains which balance? New balance. So for example, let us deal this one with some amount. So okay, so A has initially 1000 rupees. A has initially 1000 rupees. So now old balance is equal to what here? Old balance is equal to 1000. Okay. Now new balance is equal to old balance minus 500. What is the old balance here? 1000 minus 500. So what will be the new balance now? 500. Okay. So what will be the new balance now? 500. This new balance is assigned to A, account holder A. Okay. Now after deducting the amount, we will close the account. So these are the series of operations, series of tasks that we used to perform to complete one transaction. In the same manner, to deposit, we used to deduct amount, we used to credit amount to B's account. Okay. So there the series of steps will be involved. So what are those series? We have to open account B. Next we need to check the B's balance. Okay. So this is my friend's account. So what will my friend do? He used to open his account. First he used to check the balance. Later, see here, he used to check his old balance, and after crediting 500 to my friend's account, then what will his balance become? It will become a new balance, right? For example, let us discuss this one with this simple numeric values. For example, here B contains initially 500 rupees. Okay. Now, what is the B balance here? B balance is nothing but 500, which is nothing but what here? Old balance. Old balance is equal to 500. Okay. Now, after crediting this 500 to my friend's account, what will the balance become? See, old balance plus 500. That is 500 old balance plus 500. That is what here? 1000. Okay. Now, this 1000 will become new balance. So, what is here? New balance is equal to 1000. And now, this will become the B balance account. So, just to do a single operation, here we used to follow a sequential steps, the tasks. So, with some rules and regulations. That is what we called as a transaction. It involves a series of operations. Sequential operations. Clear? Now, operations in transactions. What are the basic operations in transactions? We used to do only two. Read operation and write operation. Okay. So, what is read operation? Read operation reads the data from the database and then stores it in a buffer in the main memory. Okay. What will read operation will do? Read operation reads the data from the database and it will store in buffer. Okay. In the main memory. Right. Next, why we used to store in buffer? Because for temporary purpose, we used to store the data in a buffer. Why? Because if at all, we used to change the data in the middle of the transaction. Okay. Sometimes we used to change some particular data in the middle of the transactions. So, if at all, I used to store in the main memory, then I used to update it in the main memory. That will not be very effective. Okay. So, what if at all we used to deal with the main memory very frequently, it is not at all good, right? So, we used to maintain a buffer first. Why? Because here some of the transactions may fail in the middle. Then what will happen? A disturbance, some inconsistency will be there in the database. So, that is the reason we used to maintain some buffer. That means for temporary storage. So, later on we used to do all the operations in this buffer, and if at all the operations are successful, then we used to update it in the main memory. Okay. That is what the purpose of here buffer. So, read operation reads the data from the database and then stores it in a buffer in the main memory. So, example, here this statement read of A, which represents, so this instruction will read the value of this particular variable A from the database and it will store it in a buffer in the main memory. That is what the intention of the instruction read of A. Okay. Now what is write operation here? So write operation writes the updated data value back to the database from the buffer. So we used to store the data in a database through buffer, right? First of all, while storing into the main memory, we used to keep the data in the buffer. If at all we used to change or any updations we have to make, we used to interact with the buffer. And if at all the changes are made, then our data is very good and consistent, then we used to update it permanently to the database. Otherwise, still it will be in the buffer. Okay. So what is the write operation here? Write operation will write the updated data back to the database. Okay, from the buffer. So here write of A, this instruction will write the updated value of A from the buffer to the database. So these are the two basic operations in the transactions. So let us these two operations with a simple example what we have discussed in the previous slide. Okay. So let's say your account A and your friend's account B. Just what I have explained you. You are transferring rupees 100 from A to B. The steps of transactions are. Here I used to transfer 100 rupees from A to B. Okay. Here A is nothing but myself. B is my friend's account. So here A initially contains 500. B initially contains 200. Whatever the steps of transactions here I used to perform. This is transaction 1. This is transaction 2. T1, T2 represents transaction 1 and transaction 2. To perform a single operation, here we used to perform sequential number of steps. So here, first of all, I used to read this account A. So read of A. That means I used to read the value, this 500. Okay, read the value from the database and I will store it in a buffer. Next, I used to deduct 100 rupees from that 500. I used to deduct 100 rupees from that 500. Okay. So here now the A value will be updated, right? So 500. So A value is 500 initially minus 100. So what is the value? 400. Now the A value is nothing but what? 400. It will be updated, right? So here we have to update this value, right? Here we have to update this 400. So here we used to represent it as write of A. Write is for what? Updating the value from the buffer to the database. Okay. So here this value is stored temporarily in the buffer and from the buffer it will be updated to the database permanently through the write operation. Okay. So now the same thing which my friend will check whether the amount is credited or not. What he will do? First, he will check the balance. Okay. Read of B. Right. Next, here B is equal to B plus 100. That means 100 will be credited to this particular balance. That means it will become what? 300. Why? Because initially it has 200. 200 plus 100. 300. Now the B value is 300. And this value must be updated to the database. How? By using write instruction. Okay. So write instruction is used to write back or update to the database from the buffer. Clear? So the final value is nothing but what? 400 and after transaction the final value will be 300. That is what these are the basic operations in the database. Next, here this is the very important concept that is nothing but transaction states. So here we used to deal with 6 states of transactions. 6 states. So what are those 6 states? Active state. This is the first state, that is nothing but active state. Next, partially committed state. Okay. Next, failed state. Okay. Next, for example, committed state, abort state, and last final state is nothing but terminated state. Okay. So whenever the transaction has been started, then the transaction is under active state. We can say that the transaction is under active state. If at all I used to start a transaction, that is, let us take the previous example. First transaction is what? Read of A. Okay. I used to read the data from the database to the buffer. That is what? So whenever I used to read the data, that comes under active state. Okay. Till the end, till the end, the transaction will be, till the end means till terminated. If the transaction has been completed, so it will be in a active state only. Okay, this is the initial state. Next, partially committed state. So what is this partially committed state? So here, what is the purpose of introducing partially committed state means? So here the transaction has been started. What I said, whatever the operations that we are going to do, we used to do it in a buffer, local buffer, not in the main database, we must not connect to the main memory directly. Okay. So here the purpose of introducing partially committed state is nothing but whether we have to update or else we have to change the data in the middle of the transactions, then we can change here itself. This just like a buffer. Okay. Then we can change here itself. Whatever the changes that you have to do, you can change here by using what operations? Read or write operations. Once the transaction has been started, we have to do read and write operations. Okay. We used to perform the transactions or series of actions, and that comes under partially committed state. Why? Because all these actions will be done in a local buffer. Okay. After committing whatever the actions that we have done, that means after doing all the transactions and we are successful and those transactions are successful, then we used to update those results in committed state. Okay. So if at all the transaction may fail in the middle, right? That is what here. So if at all I used to perform some read operation and due to some issue, some hardware issue or some software issue or some power failure, so in the middle of the transaction, it has been failed. So from here, it will go to what? Failed state. And initially also, the transaction may fail. Sometimes initially also the transaction may fail. Okay. That is why here it is connected to the failed state. Clear? So here, what is the purpose of partially committed state? If at all we used to do transactions in the middle, or else we used to update the data, whatever the data that we used to update, that will be done in the local buffer. Okay. Why? Because we must not disturb the original database. That is what the main reason. We must not if at all this partially committed state is not there. Okay. And assume that this partially committed state is not there, and this transaction is directly communicating with this one. Okay. For example, I am communicating with this one. I am reading the data A. Okay. I am reading the data A from this here. And meanwhile, see, B has updated this data. Okay, B has updated this data. Okay, B has updated this data to 200. This is one user. This is another user. Okay, one user read the data. Okay, another user meanwhile he has updated this one. Now the database contains which value? Now the database contains 200. Why? Because it has been updated. Then what value I have read before? I have read 100. That is not there in the database now. That is what the disturbance here. We must not directly communicate with the database. Why? Because these kind of disturbances will occur. One user may update in the same time. One user may update the data which is already existing. Okay, this might be removed in our future cases. Okay, in the next classes, I used to deal these kind of conflicts. How to remove these kind of conflicts in the transactions which occurred in the transactions. Clear? Now, so that is what the purpose of partially committed state. Whatever the actions that we used to perform in the local buffer rather than communicating with the database. Simply. Clear? So, if at all the transactions are successful, then we used to update this data permanently to the committed state. That is why here I have mentioned permanent storage. So, whatever, if the transactions are successful in the partially committed state, the content will be updated permanently in the committed state. So, this partially committed state may fail in the middle of the transactions. That is why it came to the failed state, and initially the transaction even before starting also it may fail due to some issues, that also comes to the failed state. Then what is abort state? So here, for example, so I used to update, or else I used to fail here after doing some transaction. For example, A is equal to 100 initially. A is equal to 100. So here I want to update B is this A. A is equal to 200. I want to update A is equal to 200. Okay. So while updating this value, it has been already updated. After updating, and I may not store it in a database permanently. That is, it has been updated temporarily. Okay, it has been updated temporarily. And this data, for example, power failure occurs here. Okay, power failures occurs. If at all I didn't save that one, just have been updated and power failures occurs, or else some software issues. Okay, then what it will come to the failed state. Okay, then what we have to do? Whether we have to store A is equal to 100 or A is equal to 200. Okay, it has been not updated. So it must be roll back to A is equal to 100, to the initial value, right? Just like, so let us deal this one with a simple example. We all use washing machines, right? So if at all we used to start a washing machine, and it is running, or okay, just think that it is in a spin mode. Okay, so if at all it is power failure occurs, in the middle of spinning, power failure may occur. So the washing machine stops working. Clear? Now again the power came. So at which state the washing machine will be? At which state? Spinning state only, right? Spinning state. Whenever, whatever the state it has been stopped, that state only it used to restart. It has to know that this state I have stopped, so I have to start from this state only. Okay, the same thing here. Okay, so that is what here, rollback operation. So whatever the value that I should take, the previous value, or I used to cancel this transaction, that will be comes under abort state, which will be more concentrated on rollback operations. Okay, and the last final state is nothing but terminated state. That means if at all transactions are successful, then it will comes under terminated. If the transactions are failure, that also next comes under last stage, terminated state. Okay, so let us discuss these states in detail. Active state. First state is what? Active state. So here this is nothing but first state of transaction. If a transaction is in execution, then it is said to be in active state. Okay, it doesn't matter which step in execution. So if at all it is in partial execute state or else committed state, whatever the state it might be. So it doesn't matter. Until unless the transaction is executing, it remains in active state. It totally remains in active state. That is what active state. Next, partially committed state. So this state contains read and write operations, as I told you. So this state contains what? Read and write operations, partially committed state. Why? Because we used to perform a series of actions. We used to read the data, we used to write or update the data back to the database. So that is what partially committed state. So reason why we have this state is because transaction can fail during execution. So one transactions or some of the transactions may fail during execution. So if we are making changes to the actual database instead of local memory, so here local memory is nothing but what? Buffer. Local memory is nothing but what? Buffer, which I have just told you, right? So buffer database may be left in an inconsistent state in case of any failure. That is the reason here we have to include partially committed state. This state helps us to roll back. So this state, what is the purpose of this state? This state is help us to roll back the changes made to the database in case of failure during execution. Next, third state, failed state. If a transaction is executing and a failure occurs, okay, either hardware or software failure, then the transaction goes into the failed state from the active state or from the partially committed state. Okay, next, committed state. If a transaction completes the execution successfully, then all the changes made in the local memory during the partially committed state are permanently stored in the database. Whatever the transactions that are successful, then those transactions will be stored permanently to the database. That state is nothing but committed state. So what is aborted state here? If a transaction fails during the execution, then the transaction goes into a failed state. So the transaction starts and it fails. Okay, during the execution, in the middle of the execution, middle of the transaction may fail. Then it also goes to the failed state, and from that failed state, we used to go to abort state by using rollback operations. Okay, so the changes made into the local memory are rolled back to the previous consistent state, and the transaction goes into the aborted state from the failed state. And the last state is nothing but what? Here, before going to deal with the last state, so we used to represent here the transaction, may be rolled back here. So rolled back means what? It must go to the either previous consistent state or the transaction, it must be killed. The transaction must be killed. So how we will come to know that whether the transaction going to restart or whether the transaction has been killed or cancelled. So here this we used to deal with. The database recovery module. Okay, the database recovery module. That means have to recover. The transaction failed now in the middle of the execution. We have to recover it by using, by representing it from the starting state, or we used to kill the transaction. How? So, can select one of the two operations after a transaction. So, what are the two operations here? Either restart a transaction or kill the transaction. Only these two. When we used to restart the transaction, if the transaction was aborted due to hardware or software failure. So here, when we used to restart, if the transaction has been cancelled or else has been disturbed due to hardware or software failure, then the transaction can be restarted. Such transaction is considered as a new transaction. Okay. So what is here kill? That means we used to cancel the transaction. When we used to kill the transaction, if a transaction was aborted due to some internal logical error or else due to some bad input. Okay, then the transaction we used to cancel or kill. Okay, so these are the two types here, restart and kill. When we used to restart and when we used to kill the transaction. These two will be represented in which state? In aborted state. Okay. Next, terminated state. So, what is here terminated state? This is the last state in the life cycle of a transaction. Last state. And after entering the committed state or aborted state, so here this is what active state. Okay. This is what partially committed state. And this is what committed state. This is what failed state. This is what abort state. And this is what terminated state. When this terminated state will come, this is the sequential steps, right? Here we used to follow. Okay. So after committed state or after aborted state, this is the last final state of a transaction. So after entering the committed state or else aborted state, then the transaction finally enters into the terminated state. So this is what the 6 states of transaction. So what we have discussed in this session, right? First, what is a transaction? It is nothing but a series of operations. And what are the operations in transactions? What are the operations here? The basic operations, read operation and write operation. So what is a read operation? So what is read operation? We used to read the data from the database. What is write operation? We used to update or write back the data to the database. Operations in database. And next, transactions. Transaction states. How many states are there? We have 6 states. That we have already discussed.